The morning of September 12, 1944, started like any other combat day in the Pacific. Major Robert "Cowboy" Stout strapped himself into his F6F Hellcat aboard the USS Hornet, expecting nothing more than a routine photo reconnaissance run. The intelligence briefing had been dismissive, almost bored in its delivery. "Fly over Peleliu," they said. "Take some pictures of the abandoned airfields. Check a box before 15,000 Marines hit those beaches in 3 days." Stout had logged 63 combat missions by this point, and this one seemed like the easiest yet. He had no idea he was about to pull off the most devastating one-man airstrike in military history. At 8,000 feet, Stout's Hellcat approached Peleliu from the east, the camera behind his cockpit clicking away automatically. That's when his blood turned to ice. The airfield wasn't abandoned. It was packed solid with Japanese aircraft, wingtip to wingtip, like a parking lot at rush hour. Mitsubishi Zeros, Nakajima torpedo bombers, Aichi dive bombers, all fueled, all armed, all ready to tear the American invasion fleet to shreds. Stout's combat-trained eyes counted fast. 40 planes minimum, possibly more. This wasn't a token defense force. This was a strike group positioned to launch a massacre against the vulnerable transport ships carrying thousands of Marines. Ships that were steaming toward Peleliu at that exact moment. His thumb hovered over the radio transmit button. Protocol screamed at him to report this. Break off. Let the fleet organize a proper strike package with fighters, bombers, the full coordinated assault. But Stout's tactical mind was already calculating the time factor. By the time he flew back, convinced skeptical intelligence officers they'd missed an entire airbase and waited for a strike group to launch, 2 hours would burn away. 2 hours for the Japanese to scatter these planes into the jungle, or worse, launch them against the fleet. Right now, at this exact moment, they were sitting ducks. Completely exposed, probably waiting for their own dawn reconnaissance before launching their attack. The window of opportunity was open, but it wouldn't stay open long. Stout dropped to 3,000 feet for a closer look, his photographer's eye cataloguing every detail while his survival instincts screamed warnings about anti-aircraft positions. What he saw made him realize something crucial. The Japanese had made a catastrophic mistake. Those aircraft weren't spread out under camouflage netting like they should have been. They were parked in tight, neat rows, barely 15 feet between each plane, looking like they were lined up for inspection day at flight school. Even more critical, they were parked directly next to their fuel supplies. Stout could see the drums stacked beside each aircraft, high-octane aviation gasoline just waiting to be pumped into tanks. One tracer round into a fuel drum would create a fireball. One burning aircraft would spread fire to its neighbors. The Japanese had accidentally built a massive chain reaction, just waiting for someone to light the fuse. The rational part of Stout's brain ran through every way this could end in disaster. Anti-aircraft fire could shred his Hellcat on the first pass. A lucky shot could sever his control lines. His guns could jam in the humid Pacific air. He could misjudge his altitude and plow into the ground at 300 miles per hour. Any of those outcomes meant dying alone on a forgotten island. His body never recovered. His family getting a telegram with those cold words, "missing in action," presumed dead. But the other side of that equation was equally clear and infinitely more important. If those Japanese planes launched their strike, American transport ships would burn. Slow, vulnerable vessels carrying Marines would become floating coffins under torpedo and bomb attack. Thousands of men would die in the water before they ever touched the beach. Stout's hand moved to the throttle and pushed it forward. The Hellcat's massive Pratt & Whitney engine roared to life, 18 cylinders generating 2,000 horsepower. He nosed the aircraft down, beginning his descent toward the airfield below. No radio calls, no more reconnaissance orbits. The decision was made in his gut, in his heart, in that part of a fighter pilot's brain that understands some opportunities only come once. In 30 seconds, he'd either become a legend or a statistic. Either way, those Japanese planes weren't going to attack the invasion fleet. He'd make absolutely certain of that or die trying. The Hellcat dropped like a stooping hawk, altimeter unwinding through 2,000 feet, 1,500, 1,000. Stout leveled off at 50 feet above the treetops, so low that palm fronds whipped in his propeller wash. At this altitude he was below most radar coverage, inside the envelope where anti-aircraft gunners struggled to track fast-moving targets. The airfield rushed toward him at over 300 miles per hour. He had maybe 3 seconds to finalize his attack geometry. The rows of Japanese aircraft were oriented northeast to southwest, parked parallel to the runway. Stout planned his approach perpendicular to those rows, which meant he'd cross multiple lines of aircraft in a single, devastating pass, instead of following one row down its length. More targets in his cone of fire, more chances to trigger the chain reaction he was betting his life on. The jungle edge disappeared beneath his nose, and suddenly the airfield opened up like a shooting gallery. Individual details snapped into focus with startling clarity. Ground crew members looking up in confusion, their faces visible for a split second before recognition turned to absolute panic. Fuel drums stacked 3 high beside each aircraft, a Zero with its engine cowling open, maintenance still in progress. These men had no idea death was screaming toward them at 300 miles per hour. They thought they owned the sky this morning. They thought they had time. Stout's thumb found the firing button on his control stick and pressed down hard. All 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns opened up simultaneously, 3 per wing, creating a sound like the fabric of reality being torn apart. The Hellcat shuddered from the recoil. Tracers arced out from his wings in brilliant streams, every 5th round glowing red-hot, so he could walk his fire onto target. Stout aimed for the gap between 2 Zeros where fuel drums clustered. The 50 caliber rounds walked across the coral tarmac, kicking up white dust, then stitched into the first Zero's fuselage. Metal skin peeled away like tissue paper under the onslaught. He held the trigger for 2 full seconds, about 25 rounds per gun, 150 rounds total, then adjusted his aim slightly left. The fuel drums exploded in a cascading sequence that looked almost choreographed. The first drum erupted in an orange fireball that immediately spread to its neighbors. High-octane aviation gasoline doesn't just burn when it's atomized and ignited. It detonates, creating overpressure waves that propagate through vapor like dominoes falling. The explosion caught the Zero's wing tank, which had been topped off for the morning's planned strike. The fighter disappeared in a secondary blast that sent burning fuel spraying across 2 adjacent aircraft like napalm. Stout was already past them, his tracers finding the next row, hammering into a Nakajima torpedo bomber's bloated fuselage. This aircraft was bigger, heavier, absolutely packed with fuel for long-range strikes against ships. When its tanks ruptured, the blast was powerful enough that Stout felt the shockwave buffet his Hellcat, even as he raced past at 300 miles per hour. He was 4 seconds into the run now, roughly halfway across the airfield, and behind him the world was transforming into hell on Earth. Fires were spreading with terrifying speed. The Japanese had parked these aircraft close enough that burning fuel from one pooled under its neighbors. Aircraft aluminum melts at 1220 degrees Fahrenheit. Aviation gasoline burns at 2500 degrees. Wing tanks were rupturing from heat stress even before flames touched them, dumping hundreds of gallons of fuel that flash-ignited instantly. Ground crew members were running in every direction, some trying to reach fire equipment, most just fleeing for their lives. They'd been performing routine maintenance 30 seconds ago. Now they were trapped in an inferno. Anti-aircraft positions were starting to react, muzzle flashes winking from camouflaged positions near the runway, but they were firing blindly, tracking smoke and chaos rather than the Hellcat that had already blown past their fields of fire. Stout kept his finger locked on the trigger, oozing rounds across the 3rd and 4th rows of parked aircraft. A line of Aichi dive bombers absorbed his fire, their thin aluminum skins providing zero protection against 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds. One of them had ordnance still loaded underneath. He glimpsed bombs slung under the wings in the fraction of a second before his tracers found them. The explosion was absolutely catastrophic, a massive detonation that sent a mushroom cloud of black smoke boiling upward. Shrapnel from the blast shredded 2 nearby Zeros like a giant shotgun blast, turning pristine fighters into twisted metal sculptures in an eye blink. The entire airfield was now an uncontrolled conflagration. What had started as surgical strikes on fuel drums had evolved into something that looked like the end of the world. Fire was jumping from aircraft to aircraft, spreading through pools of burning gasoline that flowed across the tarmac, following the slight grade of the runway downhill. Secondary explosions were popping off every few seconds as ammunition cooked off inside burning aircraft. Machine gun rounds for the fighters, 20mm cannon shells, even some of the smaller bombs that hadn't been loaded yet. Each explosion fed the chaos, creating more shrapnel, more fires, more destruction. The smoke was rising in thick black columns now, the kind of smoke that would be visible from the carrier task force, 50 miles away. A fuel truck that had been servicing the bombers took a burst of his fire and exploded with enough force to flip it onto its side. Its cargo of high-octane fuel, adding another 1,000 gallons to the inferno spreading across the tarmac. The heat was so intense now that Stout could feel it in his cockpit even at 300 miles per hour, a wave of thermal energy that made the air shimmer and distorted his view of the targets ahead. His ammunition counters were winding down fast. He'd burned through about half his load in that first devastating pass, maybe 1,200 rounds across all 6 guns. But the destruction was multiplying beyond anything he could have achieved through gunfire alone. The Japanese had created their own perfect storm of vulnerability, and Stout had been the spark that set it all in motion. He pulled up sharply at the end of the airfield, climbing to 500 feet to assess the damage and plan his next move. Anti-aircraft fire was intensifying now, black puffs of 25mm shells bursting around his aircraft, as gunners finally got their range dialed in. Tracers from light machine guns arced up from multiple positions, creating a web of fire he had to navigate through. The Japanese were panicking, firing at anything that moved, but their accuracy was terrible. Fear and smoke were destroying their aim. Stout banked hard right, using his altitude advantage to stay outside the envelope of the heaviest ground fire, while he took stock of what he'd accomplished in that first pass. The northern section of the airfield was completely engulfed in flames. At least 15 aircraft were burning or already destroyed, reduced to blackened skeletons of their former selves. Wings had melted off. Fuselages had collapsed. Tail sections pointed at odd angles toward the sky like grave markers. But the southern section still had intact targets. Stout counted another 20 to 25 aircraft that his first pass hadn't touched. Some were already being moved by desperate ground crews trying to taxi them away from the fires, which was exactly the wrong thing to do, because it exposed them in the open away from any cover. They were making his job easier. Stout grinned behind his oxygen mask and pushed the stick forward, lining up for his second run. This pass was going to be different, and Stout knew it. The element of surprise was completely gone, replaced by a fully alerted enemy who'd watched the first attack turn their airfield into a crematorium. Every anti-aircraft gun on Peleliu was tracking him now, crews frantically cranking elevation wheels and leading his flight path. The smoke was also a major factor. Thick columns of black rising thousands of feet, obscuring targets and creating turbulence that made precise flying nearly impossible. But those remaining aircraft on the southern dispersal area represented just as much threat as the ones already burning. If even 5 of those planes got airborne, they could still cause devastating damage to the invasion fleet. He couldn't leave them intact. He had to finish the job. He came in from a different angle this time, approaching from the southeast instead of retracing his first run. Basic survival tactics that every fighter pilot learned. Never repeat the same attack pattern, because gunners learn to anticipate your path and they'll be waiting for you. His airspeed was slightly lower, around 280 miles per hour, giving him better target resolution but also making him more vulnerable to ground fire. The trade-off was necessary. At 310 miles per hour, everything had been a blur of speed and violence. At 280, he could pick specific targets and make every remaining round count. His ammunition situation was getting critical. Maybe 800 rounds left across all 6 guns, which translated to about 6 seconds of firing time if he held the trigger down continuously. The anti-aircraft fire was a light show of death. Tracers crisscrossed his flight path, some passing so close he could see the glowing projectile streaking past his canopy like angry fireflies. A 25mm shell burst 30 feet to his left, close enough that shrapnel rattled against his fuselage with a sound like hail on a tin roof. Another burst dead ahead, forcing him to jink right and spoil his aim for a precious second. The Japanese gunners were getting better, adjusting to his speed and altitude, setting up kill boxes he had to fly through. Every instinct screamed at him to break off, to climb away from this hellstorm of steel, but he pressed on. Stout opened fire on a group of 5 Zeros that ground crews were desperately trying to taxi toward the jungle. His tracers found the lead aircraft raking it from propeller to tail. The Zero's fuel tank erupted and suddenly the pilot was scrambling out of the burning cockpit, his flight suit already on fire. The aircraft rolled to a stop and became another torch, adding to the conflagration. Stout adjusted aim, caught the second Zero as it tried to swing away, hammered rounds into its engine. Coolant sprayed in a white mist. The engine seized and the plane shuddered to a halt, dead in the water. 3 more bursts took out 2 more fighters in the group. The 5th Zero made it to the tree line before a lucky shot from Stout's last few rounds punctured something vital, and it nosed over into the jungle, out of commission even if not completely destroyed. His guns clicked empty on the port side. The 3 left-wing Brownings had run completely dry. He still had his starboard guns, maybe 300 rounds remaining, but the asymmetric firepower made aiming trickier. The Hellcat wanted to pull left from the unbalanced recoil. He compensated with rudder pressure, his right leg straining against the pedal, finding more targets through the smoke and chaos. A pair of dive bombers sat near a camouflaged revetment, probably being armed for a strike mission when Stout's attack began. He walked his remaining tracers across both aircraft, punching holes through cockpits and fuel cells. One caught fire immediately, flames licking up from the engine compartment. The other just sat there leaking fuel until the spreading flames from its neighbour reached the puddle, and both aircraft went up together in a satisfying double explosion. Something slammed into his Hellcat's tail section with a tremendous bang that made the whole aircraft shudder. A solid hit. Stout's eyes flashed to his instrument panel, scanning for red lights or falling gauge needles that would indicate critical damage. Oil pressure holding steady. Hydraulics nominal. Control surfaces still responding to his inputs. Whatever had hit him hadn't severed anything critical, but it was a stark reminder that his luck couldn't hold forever. Every second he stayed over this airfield increased the probability of a Japanese gunner getting lucky and putting a shell somewhere his Hellcat couldn't absorb. He was living on borrowed time. He squeezed off his last burst at a fuel truck near the runway, watched it explode in a spectacular ball of orange flame, then pulled up hard and headed for open ocean. His starboard guns were dry now too, all 2,400 rounds expended in roughly 15 seconds of actual trigger time spread across 2 passes. Behind him, the airfield at Peleliu was dying. Stout risked one look back over his shoulder as he climbed to a safer altitude, and the sight was almost unreal in its completeness. The entire facility looked like a vision of the apocalypse. Columns of black smoke merging into a single massive pillar that rose over 10,000 feet into the tropical sky, visible for 100 miles in every direction. The northern section was still an inferno, flames so intense they created their own weather system, sucking in air from the surrounding jungle. The southern section wasn't much better. Nearly every aircraft he'd targeted on his second pass was burning or disabled, adding their smoke to the apocalyptic scene. From 5 miles away, the heat shimmer was visible, distorting the air above the runway like a mirage in the desert. Ground crews had abandoned any pretense of fighting the fires and were simply trying to survive, staying clear of the ammunition that continued to cook off in random staccato bursts. Some were probably dead, caught in the initial explosions, or trapped between burning aircraft. War was ugly that way, but Stout couldn't afford sympathy for men who'd been preparing to kill thousands of American Marines. The tactical implications were staggering, and Stout's mind shifted from immediate survival to strategic assessment as his adrenaline began to level out. 40 Japanese aircraft destroyed or rendered completely inoperable in approximately 8 minutes of action. That wasn't just a successful strike, it was the complete elimination of Japanese air power in the Peleliu sector. Those aircraft had represented the Japanese Navy's entire planned response to the American invasion. Without them, the Japanese garrison on Peleliu was blind and defenseless against air attack. The Marines landing on September 15th, just 3 days away, would have total air superiority from the moment their landing craft hit the beach. No torpedo bombers diving on transport ships, no dive bombers strafing the beaches, no Zeros shooting up the support vessels, just clear skies and American air cover. The math was brutal, but elegantly simple. Each of those torpedo bombers could have sunk or crippled a transport ship, and each transport carried roughly 1,500 Marines plus their equipment. A coordinated strike by even half of those 40 aircraft could have devastated the invasion fleet, turning the shallow waters off Peleliu into a graveyard of burning ships and drowning men. Stout had prevented that nightmare scenario single-handedly, acting on instinct and training and the kind of split-second courage that can't be taught in flight school. The Marines who would storm those beaches wouldn't know his name. They'd never hear about the lone pilot who destroyed an entire airbase to save them, but they'd be alive because of what he did this morning. His fuel gauge was reading lower than he liked, the combat maneuvering and high-speed passes having burned through his reserves faster than planned. He pointed the Hellcat's nose toward the coordinates where the USS Hornet should be, and settled into a steady cruise climb. The hole in his tail section was causing some minor drag, making the aircraft slightly tail-heavy, but nothing he couldn't compensate for with trim adjustments. The adrenaline was starting to wear off now, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made his hands shake slightly on the controls. Combat did that. The human body could only sustain maximum alertness for so long before the crash came. The radio came alive with urgent chatter, pulling him out of his thoughts. Other pilots reporting the massive smoke column rising from Peleliu, visible from 50 miles away. Carrier controllers demanding to know what was happening, their voices tight with concern and confusion. The entire fleet had watched that pillar of smoke rise into the sky, and nobody had any idea what caused it. Stout keyed his microphone and delivered what might have been the most understated after-action report of his entire career. His voice calm and almost bored despite what he'd just accomplished. Hornet Control, this is Stout. Mission complete. Peleliu airfield neutralized. Returning to base. The radio went dead silent for several long seconds, as if the controller couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Then the voice came back, carefully professional, but unable to hide the disbelief underneath. Say again your last, Stout. Did you say neutralized? Stout allowed himself a small smile behind his oxygen mask, imagining the chaos erupting in the carrier's operations center as they tried to process what one pilot had just reported. Affirmative, Hornet. The airfield is no longer operational. You'll want to scramble a photo reconnaissance bird to get documentation. Stout out. He clicked off the radio before they could ask more questions, preferring to save the full story for the debriefing. Right now, he just wanted to get his shot-up Hellcat back on deck and maybe grab a cup of coffee before the inevitable interrogation began. His hands were definitely shaking now, the post-combat adrenaline dump hitting hard. He flexed his fingers on the stick, trying to work some feeling back into them. 8 minutes of the most intense combat flying of his life, and his body was finally starting to register what he'd just survived. 40 minutes later, Stout's Hellcat touched down on the Hornet's deck, the tailhook snagging the number 3 wire with a jolt that snapped his body forward against the harness straps. Deck crew swarmed the aircraft immediately, and their eyes went wide when they saw the damage up close. The tail section was riddled with shrapnel holes, big enough to stick a fist through in some places. Hydraulic fluid was streaking the fuselage, scorch marks on the wings from flying through his own explosions. The plane captain who climbed up to help Stout out of the cockpit just stared at him, then at the empty ammunition counters showing all guns dry, then back at Stout with an expression of pure disbelief. The whole deck seemed to pause as word spread like wildfire. The pilot who'd created that massive smoke column visible from 50 miles away had just landed. By the time Stout's boots hit the deck, a crowd had formed. Pilots, deck crew, officers, all staring at him like he'd just returned from the dead. Maybe he had. The odds of surviving what he'd just done were astronomically low. Someone started clapping, then others joined in. Within seconds, the entire flight deck was applauding, the sound echoing off the carrier's superstructure. Stout waved them off, embarrassed by the attention, just wanting to get below deck and file his report. The intelligence debriefing lasted 3 grueling hours. Stout sat in the carrier's intelligence center with maps spread across the table, walking senior officers through every detail of the attack, while photo reconnaissance birds confirmed his damage assessments. The pictures told the story better than words ever could. 40 aircraft reduced to burned-out husks, their twisted frames barely recognizable, the airfield cratered and smoking, fires still burning hours after the attack. Fuel dumps destroyed, support structures collapsed, the entire facility rendered completely non-operational. The intelligence officers kept asking the same questions in different ways, as if they couldn't quite believe one pilot had accomplished this alone. How many passes did you make? Just 2. How much ammunition did you expend? All of it. Were you hit? Yes, but nothing critical. Did you have wingmen providing cover? No, I was alone. The questions eventually stopped, replaced by a silence that felt like reverence mixed with shock. One of the senior intelligence officers, a commander with 20 years of service, just shook his head slowly and muttered something about never seeing anything like this in his entire career. Another officer started calculating the strategic impact, running numbers on how many American lives had been saved by removing that air threat. The estimates ranged from hundreds to thousands, depending on how effectively the Japanese could have coordinated their strike. Every number represented real people, real Marines who would make it home because of what Stout had done. The Navy awarded Stout the Navy Cross for the Peleliu mission, the service's second highest decoration for valor, surpassed only by the Medal of Honor. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in aerial combat against enemy Japanese forces." But the official recognition came months later, long after Stout had flown dozens more missions and the war had ground forward through more islands, more invasions, more desperate fights. The medal ceremony was brief and understated, conducted on the Hornet's flight deck between combat operations. Stout accepted the medal, saluted, and went back to flying missions like it was just another day at the office. He never talked much about Peleliu with other pilots, deflecting questions with modest shrugs and changes of subject. In the ready room culture of carrier aviation, where egos ran hot and pilots competed to tell the best war stories over cards and coffee, Stout's reticence stood out like a sore thumb. He'd done something genuinely extraordinary, something that would be taught in tactical schools for decades, but he seemed almost embarrassed by the attention it brought. When pressed, he'd just say he saw an opportunity and took it, like any pilot would have done in his position. But everyone knew that wasn't true. Most pilots would have followed protocol, radioed back, waited for orders. Stout had trusted his instincts and acted decisively in a moment when hesitation would have cost thousands of lives. After the war ended in August 1945, following the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender, Stout returned to civilian life with the same quiet determination that had characterized his military service. He settled in California during the post-war boom, worked in the aerospace industry that was exploding with government contracts and innovation, raised a family in the suburbs, and lived a life that looked completely ordinary from the outside. He rarely mentioned his combat record, even to close friends and colleagues. His children grew up barely knowing their father had been a decorated Navy pilot who'd done something remarkable during the war. It wasn't modesty exactly. It was more like he'd filed that chapter of his life away and moved on to the next one, the way you close a book after finishing it. It wasn't until decades later, when military historians began systematically documenting the Pacific War's lesser-known actions, that Stout's Peleliu mission started receiving the attention it deserved from the broader historical community. Researchers digging through after-action reports and carrier deck logs found the documentation of his solo attack and recognized it as one of the most devastating single-pilot strikes in aviation history. The numbers were simply staggering. 40 aircraft destroyed in 8 minutes by one pilot acting alone. No other pilot in World War II, on either side, had accomplished anything comparable in a single mission. Some had higher total kill counts spread across hundreds of missions, but nobody had matched the concentrated destruction Stout achieved in those 8 minutes over Peleliu. The mission's influence on military doctrine was subtle but real and lasting. Air Force and Navy tactical schools studied Stout's attack as a case study in exploiting enemy mistakes and understanding secondary effects in target-rich environments. The principle of attacking concentrated enemy assets to create cascading failures became a cornerstone of ground attack strategy that's still taught today. His willingness to act decisively when presented with a fleeting opportunity, even outside the bounds of his original orders, became an example of the kind of initiative that modern militaries try to cultivate in their officers. The mission proved that under the right circumstances, with the right combination of skill, courage, and situational awareness, one pilot could change the course of a battle and save thousands of lives. Major Robert "Cowboy" Stout passed away in 1989 at the age of 73, having lived to see the Cold War end and the military tactics he'd helped pioneer become standard doctrine in air forces around the world. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Navy service in passing, but gave it only a single paragraph, focusing instead on his aerospace career and his family. The people who attended his funeral, neighbors and co-workers and friends from his civilian life, mostly had no idea that the quiet man they'd known had once destroyed an entire enemy airbase in 8 minutes of violence over a forgotten island in the Pacific. They knew him as a good neighbor, a dedicated father, a skilled engineer, not as the pilot who'd pulled off one of the most remarkable combat missions in aviation history, but the Marines who landed on Peleliu's beaches on September 15, 1944, the ones who weren't torn apart by torpedo bombers and dive bombers during their approach, the ones who made it to shore under clear skies with American air cover protecting them. They owed their lives to a decision one pilot made in the seconds before he pushed his Hellcat into a dive and opened fire on 40 sitting targets. Most of them never knew. They fought through 2 months of savage combat, cave by cave and ridge by ridge, some of the bloodiest ground fighting in the Pacific War. They watched friends die in the coral ridges. They endured heat and thirst and constant danger. But they didn't watch their transport ships explode and sink in the approaches. They didn't drown in burning oil or get strafed on the beaches. That nightmare scenario never happened because Robert Stout decided some opportunities only come once and some risks are worth taking. That's the legacy that matters most, not the medal or the citation or the historical footnotes. The legacy measured in thousands of men who came home, who raised families, who lived lives they would never have had if Stout had followed protocol that September morning. The ripple effects of those 8 minutes over Peleliu cascaded forward through generations. Children born, careers built, love stories written, all because one pilot saw what needed to be done and did it without hesitation. War is full of tragedy and waste and senseless death. But occasionally, in rare moments, Individual courage and decisive action can prevent catastrophe and save countless lives. September 12, 1944, was one of those moments, and Major Robert Cowboy Stout was the right man in the right place at the right time to make history.